This lesson looks at the IMC rating, also known as the IRR, or the Instrument Rating Restricted, and specifically looking at the approach minima, how to calculate it, but also how to use it as well. All of the information today comes from the AIP, provided by NATS, specifically Section 3 Aerodromes, and Aerodromes 1.1, which is conditions of use and availability of heliports and aerodromes. To start off then, let's look at some definitions, what we're actually going to be talking about today. To start with, the two different types of approach. You've got a non-precision approach, which I'm going to call an NPA here, and also a precision approach. The non-precision approach only has lateral guidance, meaning that you're told if you're too far left or too far right, but it doesn't have vertical guidance. So you're not told if you're too high or too low. NPA, non-precision, no vertical guidance. And with a PA, a precision approach, not only are you given lateral guidance, so you're told if you're too far left or too far right, but also included is vertical guidance. So you're told if you're too high or too low. And ILS is a good example of the precision approach. The obstacle clearance height. Now, the obstacle clearance height really is a minimum height which guarantees obstacle clearance in a particular area. So if we've got a side-on view of our runway here, maybe off in the distance you've got a block of flats and a church perhaps over here as well. The obstacle clearance height says if you fly at this height, you are guaranteed X amount of separation from these obstacles here. Now, in conjunction with the non-precision approach, you've got what's called a minimum descent height / minimum descent altitude. And these are both the same concept. The only difference is one is height, one is altitude. And the minimum descent height or altitude is just the lowest altitude or lowest height you can descend to on a non-precision approach. And this is whilst you don't see the runway. As soon as you see the runway on the approach, you're able to actually go below this. This is slightly different to a decision height or a decision altitude, because the decision height or decision altitude is used in conjunction with a precision approach, but it's the same idea in that it's the lowest height or the lowest altitude you're allowed to descend to on that approach whilst you can't see the runway. There's often confusion between these two concepts here, and people ask, what actually is the difference between the two? Aren't they surely just the same thing applied on different approaches? This isn't quite correct because they're subtly different in how they're used. When it comes to the minimum descent height for a non-precision approach, if this is a side-on view of the runway, and this line represents our minimum descent height. Now there's a missed approach point, which might be at the end of the runway here. Here we are coming down our approach. Now, we reach our minimum descent height and we can't see the runway. The question is, do we have to go around? No. What you can do here is fly along at this minimum descent height, looking for the runway. And if you see the runway, fantastic. You descend and try to make a landing. But actually, if you don't see the runway, you continue to fly along this minimum descent height until you reach the missed approach point. And as you do, that's when you start to go around. This differs from a decision height or a decision altitude. I'll draw the same diagram again. There's the runway. Here's our decision height. We're coming down the approach. We reach our decision height, but we can't see the runway. This is the point we have to go around, and actually you'll find this is the missed approach point, is where the glide path, the yellow, intercepts the decision height, which is the red. So we have to go around if we can't see the runway. If we can see the runway, fantastic. We just continue down the approach to make a nice smooth landing. That is the difference between the two. So with that difference in mind, let's take a look at how you actually go about calculating your minima. First things first is you start with your obstacle clearance height. The obstacle clearance height is going to be given to you on the approach chart. So let's bring up an ILS approach for Farnborough here. And we're going to see we are given some obstacle clearance heights. There's a few to choose from. You can see there's category A, B, C and D. And what happens with the obstacle clearance height is it's broken down into actually 5 categories. Each of these categories depends upon your aircraft's speed. Now the speed used is called VAT, or velocity at the threshold. Categories are A, B, C, D, and not given on this approach plate, there's also category E. Category A, the speed is anything less than 91 knots. So if you cross the threshold at the speed lower than 91 knots, you're a category A aircraft. Category B is 91 to 120 knots. So if you cross the threshold anywhere between those speeds, you're a category B aircraft. Now category C is 121 to 140 knots. Just as above, if you cross the threshold between those speeds, well, you're category C. D is 141 to 165. These are some of the bigger jets. And lastly is 166 to 210 for category E. We're talking quite specialised military jets in that scenario there. Step 1 then for calculation of our minima is choose that obstacle clearance height. One more thing to mention about our obstacle clearance heights is if you have a look here in this box, going from left to right, like this, the obstacle clearance height, which is given in brackets, gets higher and higher as our approach speed gets faster and faster. Now there are 2 reasons for this, one of which is inertia, the other of which is aeroplane speed. The aeroplane going faster means it travels a larger distance in the same amount of time. When it comes to initiating a go-around, the pilot always takes the same amount of time to initiate the go-around. He's got to actually decide to go around, reach for the throttle, push the throttle forwards. But the faster the aeroplane goes, the more distance it travels in that fixed period of time. So to maintain obstacle clearance, the obstacle clearance height has to be higher. Equally, inertia. The aeroplane's going to take time. The larger it is, the faster it goes, the more time it will take to stop going down and to start going back up again. The obstacle clearance height needs to be higher to allow for that, to still maintain obstacle clearance standards. We've established then we're flying a category A aircraft, maybe a PA-28 or a Cessna. We're going to cross that threshold at a speed much lower than 91 knots. Looking here then, our obstacle clearance height is 148 feet. The next step is compare your obstacle clearance height with known system minima. Now the system minima for a ILS is 200 feet. So you compare the obstacle clearance height with the system minima and you choose the higher of the two. So it's quite obvious here, 200 feet is much higher than 148. So actually this is the one we choose, 200 feet. Now the next step, considering we're IMC holders, we're not full IR holders, is to add a recommended 200 feet. Now note I say recommended. This is actually not a mandatory 200 feet. Some people think it is, some people argue it's not. Have a look in the AIP, this is not mandatory, but it's thoroughly recommended. We go and add 200 feet, we now have our minima up at 400 feet. Remember, this is still a height, not an altitude. Because this is a precision approach, it's an ILS, we're going to add now what's called a PEC, or a pressure error correction. We add this because the aeroplane's in approach configuration is probably flying at quite a high angle of attack, and the airflow is meeting the static port at an angle that it wasn't designed to. So you start to get altimeter errors. The rule here really is if you're flying a precision approach or a PA, then add 50 feet. If it's a non-precision approach, you don't have to add anything at all. This takes our decision height at the moment 450 feet. Something else specific to IMC rating holders is actually we have absolute minima that we have to follow. For a precision approach, the absolute minima we have to use is 500 feet. And for a non-precision approach, this absolute minima is 600 feet. Meaning that what we have to do now is we've got to take what we've calculated so far, this 450 here, and compare it to this 500 here. If it was a non-precision approach, we'd compare it to 600. Because it's an ILS, it's precision, so we compare it to 500 feet. Whichever one is higher, we now take and use. So actually, 500 feet is our decision height. However, this is a decision height. We can't measure height very accurately in our PA28 because our altimeter is set to the QNH, and QNH gives us altitude. So how do we go and fix this? This involves going back up to the approach plate and going to the very, very, very top. And there, we'll see we've got two things, an aerodrome and a threshold elevation. We're interested in the aerodrome elevation up here, which in this case, 238 feet. All we have to do is add 238 feet to the decision height we've calculated, giving us 738 feet. This here is our decision altitude. But the question still remains, what do we actually do with this number during the approach? Well, thinking about our diagram from earlier on, I'm going to draw the runway side on again down here. Mark out our decision altitude as well of 738 feet. Here we are then, flying down our approach towards the runway. We now reach 738 feet, our decision altitude. Here we make our decision. Can we see the runway? Can we see any of the required visual references? If we can, fantastic. We just continue down the approach to make a landing. However, if we can't see those references, this is the point at which we have to go around. So we initiate our go around and go and have another go. It also corresponds to the missed approach point there. So that's how we go and calculate the minima for our IMC approach. We used an ILS today, but you can go and do it for any other approach you might want to fly. Not only how to calculate that minima, but how to use it as well. In the full IMC course, you'll do at least 15 hours worth of IMC flying, all of which is great fun. It's a fantastic way to improve your skills as a pilot. So go and check out the course that we offer here.